Preying on the Poor, The Cleveland Torso Killer 1934 to 1938. Every morning before leaving for work, 34-year-old Frank Lagasse would wander around the beach on Lake Erie looking for driftwood to burn. Just before 8 a.m. on September 5, 1934, he was walking near Euclid Beach Park, 8 miles east of downtown Cleveland, when something in the distance caught his eye. When he got closer, he realized that what he first thought was a partially buried piece of tree trunk was actually the lower half of a woman's torso, with her legs amputated at the knees. Please subscribe my channels. He ran to a neighbor's house and called the police. Cuyahoga County Coroner Arthur J. Pierce examined the victim and concluded that she had been dead for about 6 months, and the discovered part of her body had been in the water for about 3 or 4 months. A preservative had been used, which explained why her body was not more decomposed. Pierce believed that she was in her mid to late 30s. An abdominal scar was the only distinguishing mark, but a hysterectomy was such a common operation that he didn't think this information would be of much help in identifying her. The next day, handyman Joseph Hedgeduke read in the newspaper about the body's discovery and contacted former Lake County Sheriff James Maloney. 2 weeks earlier, he had found what appeared to be a person's vertebrae and ribs 30 miles east in North Perry. Special Lake County Deputy Sheriff Melvin Keener told him at the time they were animal parts, so he buried them in the sand. Maloney passed the information on to Cleveland police. The upper torso, which showed signs of having been cut with a knife, matched the lower half that Lagasse had found 2 days earlier. Despite a full-scale search along Lake Erie, the upper part of an arm was the only other body part ever to be recovered. Police scoured the missing person reports of 31 women who had disappeared in the previous 6 months, the timeline during which the coroner believed the victim had been killed. None of the women had an abdominal scar. The victim's remains were placed in a box with the number 102-3 and buried in Potter's Field and Highland Park Cemetery. Unable to determine her real name, police would come to know her as the Lady of the Lake. No arrests were made in connection with her murder. Bodies along Kingsbury Run. A year later, on September 23, 1935, 16-year-old James Wagner and 12-year-old Peter Costero were playing at the top of Jackass Hill, a 60-foot slope along Kingsbury Run. The area in the heart of Cleveland was once a peaceful place where city dwellers went to enjoy quiet walks and picnics amid brooks and trees. By the 1930s, Kingsbury Run was a gully that had become a derelict jungle of weeds, bushes, and debris with railroad tracks cutting through it and hobos living in hovels within it. When the softball the two boys were tossing back and forth that September day went sailing down the hill, Wagner challenged his friend to a race. When he reached the bottom, he noticed something in the bushes a few yards away. Looking more closely, he realized that it was the remains of a naked, headless man wearing nothing but a pair of cotton socks. When the police arrived, they noticed that the victim had been emasculated. There was no blood either on the body or the ground, and the man appeared to have been killed elsewhere and the body was dumped where the teenager had found it. About 30 feet away, the police quickly found the decapitated body of a second older and stockier naked man who had also been emasculated. There were signs that the victim had been preserved using a chemical. The head belonging to the first body was found buried in the ground about 20 feet from the body. There was just enough hair above the surface of the loose earth to help police find it. The second victim's head was found 70 feet from its body. The severed genitals were found in a pile near one of the bodies, and some blood-soaked clothing was located nearby. Both men had been mutilated with a knife. Police believed they were looking for a homosexual sadist, but they had no leads. Within hours, the first victim was identified through his fingerprints as 29-year-old Edward W. Andrassy. Deputy Coroner Wilson Chamberlain estimated that he had been dead for 2 or 3 days and that he had died from being decapitated. Andrassy was a medical orderly who had a reputation as a womanizer and who had minor brushes with the law. 4 days later, his father identified Edward Andrassy's body at the morgue. The second victim was 40 to 45 years old, and his body was too decomposed to identify him through fingerprinting. He was believed to have died as much as 3 or 4 weeks earlier. On September 25, 1935, he was buried in a potter's field, taking the secret of his identity to his grave. The following morning, exactly a week after his family had last seen him alive, Andrassy was buried in St. Mary's Cemetery. More victims. In the dead of winter on January 26, 1936, a woman became tired of listening to the incessant barking of a neighborhood dog near Kingsbury Run. She bundled up and went outside to investigate. She lived in a rundown area that had small manufacturing buildings, a few shops, and old apartment buildings. The woman found 2 baskets sitting in the snow behind the Hart Manufacturing Building. She walked over to a local butcher shop and told the owner about a couple of baskets filled with hams wrapped in newspaper. When he went to investigate, he was horrified to find himself staring at the frozen parts of a human body, the lower half of a female torso, 2 thighs, a right arm, and a hand. The baskets had been covered with 2 burlap sacks. Police took fingerprints and brought the remains to the morgue. Victim was identified as Florence Polillo, a part-time prostitute in her 40s. The landlady at the rooming house where she lived had last seen Polillo when she left on January 24 at 8:30 p.m. The coroner estimated that the victim was murdered and dismembered later that night. 2 weeks after Polillo was believed to have been murdered, police found her upper torso, both lower legs, and her left arm in the yard of a vacant building. Her head was never found. Neither was her killer. The summer of 1936 was an important one for Cleveland. The city would host the Republican Party National Convention from June 9 to June 12, and the opening of the Great Lakes Exposition was to follow on June 27. This 100-day event was being held to celebrate Cleveland's centennial as an incorporated city. On June 5, just a few days shy of the Republican National Convention, 2 young boys were walking through Kingsbury Run at about 8:20 a.m. when they saw a pair of trousers wrapped in a bundle under a willow tree. Louis Cheeley, 11, and Gomez Ivy, 13, thought there might be money in the pockets and poked the bundle with a fishing pole. A human head rolled out. The latest victim had been found only a mile from where Andrassy and his nameless companion were located nearly 9 months earlier. With no fingerprints upon which to turn for clues, the head would be the only way to possibly identify the victim. After cleaning it, the coroner's office put it on display at the morgue. Over the course of the evening of June 5 and the following morning, some 2,000 people walked through and examined it, but nobody recognized the man. The following afternoon, on June 6, 2 railroad workers found a heavily tattooed naked body located 1,000 feet from where the head had been found. The coroner estimated that the man was 25 to 30 years old and had been killed about 48 hours before the first of his remains was found. The cause of death was attributed to decapitation. Police combed missing person records, hoping the tattoos would lead them to the victim's identity, but it proved to be a dead end. So were his fingerprints, as they weren't on file with any official agency. A photo of the head was published in newspapers and a description of the victim was broadcast on the radio, but to no avail. Authorities displayed a plaster death mask of the head at the popular Great Lakes Exposition. Thousands of visitors stared at the mask throughout the summers of 1936 and 1937, but nobody stepped forward to identify the man. On July 22, 1936, 17-year-old Marie Barkley was hiking through a wooded area near her home in the Cleveland suburb of Brooklyn Heights, when she stumbled upon a naked, decapitated, and decomposed male body at about 11:30 a.m. Police found the head more than 10 feet from the body. It appeared that the man had been killed where his remains were found, and his blood-stained clothing was located nearby. The victim was about 40 years old and had been dead for 2 months, longer than the tattoo man who had been discovered the previous month. He was the serial killer's only victim on the city's west side. The body and the clothes bore no identifying marks, and there were no papers in the pockets of his clothing. The corpse was too decomposed for fingerprinting to be successful, and a search of missing person reports proved fruitless in identifying the body. A vagrant was sitting on an abutment in Kingsbury Run on the morning of September 10, 1936, when he spotted 2 halves of a headless, white male torso minus the limbs, floating in the murky water. Hundreds of onlookers gathered to watch as police and firefighters dragged the water and found the lower half of both legs. The victim was about 25 to 30 years old and had been emasculated. Judging by the way in which the body was dismembered, police believed that the killer had some knowledge of human anatomy. They speculated that he was either a medical student or a butcher. Unless the victim's arms and head turned up, it would be impossible to identify him. An estimated 100,000 people came to the area the next day to watch the police operation as divers searched the water unsuccessfully. The investigation had turned into a public circus. Serial killer on the loose. It was now clear that a savage serial killer was on the loose in Cleveland. Police detectives Peter Merillo and Martin Zalewski were assigned to work on the case full-time. They investigated hundreds of leads over the next 2 years and interviewed and eliminated a number of suspects, but they never tracked down the torso killer. Newspapers began talking about a crazed killer and a human butcher, dubbing him the Mad Butcher of Kingsbury Run. Newspapers started devoting more space to the murders, which boosted circulation figures. But authorities were concerned about the potential for public panic. In an editorial that appeared on September 12, 1936, the Cleveland News commented, "Of all horrible nightmares come to life, shuddering is the fiend who decapitates his victims in the dark, dank recesses of Kingsbury Run." The newspaper also promised a $1,000 reward, a large amount of money for the time, for information leading to the arrest and conviction of the Kingsbury Run murderer. The murders presented negative publicity for the city while the Great Lakes Exposition was happening. They were more than embarrassing national news headlines for Cleveland. Publicity about the murders led to a flood of people contacting the police with tips and letters offering solutions to the killings, but the police came no closer to closing the case. 5 of the victims were not identified and had not been reported missing, which led investigators to the conclusion that they were vagrants, or at least they had nobody close enough to be curious about their disappearance. Investigation intensified. Elliot Ness had become Cleveland's safety director in December 1935. With the public getting increasingly worried about the unsolved murders, Ness took charge of the investigation on September 12, 1936. 3 days later, Coroner A.J. Pierce held an emergency meeting at the Central Police Station. More than 30 police officials and medical experts got together to examine and discuss each piece of evidence collected in the case so far. The group concluded that the killer was a large, powerful man, because he was able to wield a knife with such strength and haul the bodies into an area of Kingsbury Run that was not accessible by car. He probably dismembered his victims somewhere in one of the neighborhoods around Kingsbury Run. On February 23, 1937, 55-year-old Robert Smith was walking along the beach searching for driftwood at Beulah Park on Lake Erie, 10 miles northeast of Kingsbury Run. At 1:40 p.m. he saw something white just off the shore. At first he thought it was a sheep or a dog's body, but he notified police when he realized that it was human remains, specifically the upper half of a woman's headless and armless torso. Her remains were found not far from where the first victim had been spotted in September 1934. There were no footprints, the torso had washed up on the beach. Police fanned out looking for other remains. The pathologist examined the victim and said that she was 25 to 35 years old and that she had died within the past 2 to 4 days. The lower torso surfaced on May 5, 1937, but the head, arms, and legs were never found, and the victim was never identified. In March 1937, Cuyahoga County Coroner Samuel Gerber issued a report about the first 7 murders. He said that the absence of blood clots in 4 of the victims suggested death by decapitation, or they were decapitated soon after being murdered. Without any viable leads, Police Chief George Matowitz wrote to Cleveland newspaper editors in April 1937 asking them to tell their readers to report anything suspicious to the police. The remains of the next victim were found on June 6, 1937. Teenager Russell Lauer was on his way home at 5:40 p.m. when he walked past the Lorraine Carnegie Bridge. He stopped to take a closer look at something sticking out of a relatively fresh pile of garbage and dirt. It was a skull. Police found a burlap bag beneath the Lorraine Carnegie Bridge that spans the Cuyahoga River. It contained a human skeleton minus the arms and legs, and the pathologist determined that it was from a petite African-American woman 30 to 40 years old who had been dead for about a year. Police hoped that her bridge work would help them identify her. Police detective Peter Merylo tentatively identified the torso killer's latest victim as 40-year-old Rose Wallace, but Wallace had apparently disappeared on August 21, 1936, nearly 3 months after Coroner Gerber estimated the time of death. The Cincinnati dentist who was responsible for her bridge work had died 15 years earlier, and her dental records were destroyed, so a positive identification through dental records could never be confirmed. In April 1938, a man told police that he believed the victim was his mother, Rose Wallace, despite the fact that the timing of her disappearance did not fit with the coroner's timeline. This development did not bring Merylo any closer to finding the killer. 2 men spotted something white floating in the Cuyahoga River on the morning of July 6, 1937, and it turned out to be the lower half of a male torso. The torso's upper half was found in a burlap bag wrapped in 3-week-old newspaper. Police searched the river and found the right thigh, left lower leg, and left upper arm. The next day they found the forearms with the hands attached, making fingerprinting a possibility. The right upper arm and lower right leg turned up later, but the head was never found. The man was 40 years old, and he had been killed 48 hours earlier. State and federal identification bureaus checked the fingerprints of the victim through civilian and military records, but without success. By mid-July, police had everything except the latest victim's head and his name. Reward offered. By October, police had made no further progress in the case. Official Detective Stories magazine promised a $5,000 reward for information leading to the arrest and conviction of Cleveland's torso killer, as long as the magazine gained exclusive rights to the informant's story. Predictably, letters, signed and unsigned, and phone calls poured in, as did tips from police informants and detectives working on other cases. As many as 50 tips a day came to police attention, but none led to the torso killer. Merylo and Zalewski, who were working on the case full-time, had questioned more than 1,500 people by March 1938. A lower leg was discovered in the Cuyahoga River on April 8, 1938. 3 weeks later, on May 2, police found a burlap sack containing both halves of a headless torso, another thigh, and a left foot. They matched the leg found a month earlier. The female victim of about 25 to 30 years old had been dead for a month before being found. A massive amount of morphine was detected in her system, but like most of the serial killer's victims, she was never identified. The torso killer's final victims were found on August 16, 1938. After the 12th victim was discovered, pilots of the National Guard flew over the area where the remains of the 11th victim had been spotted. They hoped the aerial photos could lead police closer to the killer. Over a period of 4 years, the Mad Butcher of Kingsbury Run had claimed a dozen victims. Only 2 would be identified. Nobody had reported any one of them missing, which led police to speculate that the torso killer targeted transients, prostitutes, and other marginalized people living on the fringe of society. Raid on Kingsbury Run. At 12:40 a.m. on August 18, 1938, 25 detectives and uniformed policemen led by Ness pulled up in 11 vehicles and prepared to raid the hobo jungles of Kingsbury Run. Less than half an hour later, some positioned themselves to block off possible escape routes from the shantytown while others moved quietly through the darkness and towards the sprawl of dilapidated shacks. A searchlight mounted atop a fire truck shone a light on the scene as police officers moved from one shack to another. They banged on doors and woke the residents. They rounded up the occupants from about 30 huts, brought them to the police station. The vagrants were fingerprinted in case they ever became victims of the butcher. Ness justified the raid publicly as an attempt to deprive the killer of his prey. Other communities in the United States claimed that the headhunter had visited them, too. Severed parts turned up near Albany and Oswego, New York, as well as in New Castle, Pennsylvania. No connection with the Cleveland killer was found. Cleveland police also followed up on hundreds of clues, some of which turned out to be sheep's bones, a pile of chicken bones, and discarded spare ribs. Residents were so frightened that they saw torsos and discarded human remains everywhere. Police reasoned that the mad butcher likely owned a car in which to transport the bodies, and lived alone in a quiet area that would not arouse the curiosity of his neighbors. That meant he was likely well off, and the skill that he demonstrated in the way he cut up his victims' bodies suggested some medical training. Ness and his team quietly made inquiries and found a suspect in 1938 who seemed to fit the description. Suspects Dr. Francis Sweeney was a. Suspects. Dr. Francis Sweeney was a physician with a history of psychiatric treatments dating from at least December 1933. He was brought in for questioning, but he never admitted to the murders. 9 days after the last official torso victim was found in Cleveland, Sweeney had himself committed to the Soldiers and Sailors Home in Sandusky, Ohio, on August 25, 1938. He died on July 9, 1964, but the case against him as the Mad Butcher of Kingsbury Run was never proven. The Cleveland Police Department received the following letter addressed to the police chief, dated December 23, 1938, and mailed from Los Angeles. Chief of Police Matowitz, you can rest easy now, as I have come to sunny California for the winter. I felt bad operating on those people, but science must advance. I shall astound the medical profession, a man with only a D.C. What did their lives mean in comparison to hundreds of sick and disease-twisted bodies? Just laboratory guinea pigs found on any public street. No one missed them when I failed. My last case was successful. I know now the feeling of Pasteur, Thoreau, and other pioneers. Right now I have a volunteer who will absolutely prove my theory. They call me mad and a butcher, but the truth will come out. I have failed but once here. The body has not been found and never will be, but the head, minus the features, is buried on Century Boulevard, between Western and Crenshaw. I feel it my duty to dispose of the bodies as I do. It is God's will not to let them suffer. X. No buried heads were found at the location that the letter's author indicated, and the investigation shifted back to Cleveland. The Cuyahoga County Sheriff's investigators discovered that Florence Polillo and Rose Wallace knew each other and frequented the same bar, as did Edward Andrassy. They theorized that the victims had known each other and that the perpetrator had won their confidence before killing them one at a time. They thought they had found a connection between the victims when they learned of a man called Frank Dolezal. The 52-year-old Slavic immigrant bricklayer lived not far from where parts of the victims had been found. Polillo had lived with him, and Dolezal had sometimes visited Wallace. He had a penchant for carrying knives, brandishing them, and sometimes threatening to use them on his acquaintances. Investigators searched his four-room apartment and found black stains in the cracks of the floor and the baseboard, and they theorized that it was dried blood. They took scrapings, and a chemist identified them as blood. Stains on 2 of 4 knives said to have once been in Dolezal's possession were discovered to be dried blood. Chief Deputy Sheriff John Gillespie thought that he was on the trail of the serial killer. On July 5, 1939, he arrested Dolezal at 6 p.m. and took him to Cuyahoga County Jail for questioning. After 2 days of interrogation, Dolezal signed a confession to having killed Polillo in self-defense during a drunken argument. In a preliminary hearing, Justice of the Peace Myron J. Pentey reduced the murder charge against Dolezal to manslaughter. Then the case against Dolezal began falling apart. The details he gave of the Polillo killing did not match the information police possessed. He said that he threw Polillo's head, lower legs, and left arm into Lake Erie, yet all of these parts except for the head were found in the back of a vacant building. Dolezal also said that he had placed Polillo's coat and shoes behind the Hart Manufacturing Company's building, but the items of clothing were never found. Drive E. Ecker, a pathologist with Cleveland's Western Reserve University, tested the scrapings earlier identified as blood and said emphatically that they were not human blood. Dolezal recanted his confession and charged that detectives had forcefully extracted a confession from him. He committed suicide on August 24, 1939. He allegedly hanged himself in his jail cell from a wall hook that was shorter than him, but an autopsy revealed that he had suffered from 4 broken ribs, which led to speculation that police had beaten him. The county sheriff's office, the city police, and Elliot Ness each carried out intensive investigations but never found the Mad Butcher of Kingsbury Run. By October 1, 1942, Merylo was taken off the case. Like most of his victims, the identity of the Mad Butcher has never been determined. If you like my channel, please subscribe it.